So I'm very fortunate in being able to study psychedelic drugs. Psychedelic means mind revealing, mind manifesting. It's a combination of two ancient Greek words. Psyche, you'll likely know, means mind or soul, more accurately, and the other component refers to making manifest, making visible. So that's already alluding to what these compounds do. I think it's the right moniker for these drugs. It's more meaningful, actually more accurate than the term hallucinogen. I think that's a more superficial property of what these compounds do to the mind, but mind revealing is really more speaks to certainly why they're interesting, but also perhaps why they might be useful. And so part of the research that I've been doing at Imperial has been to look not just at how these compounds work in the brain, but also how they might be useful. These are compounds that can be synthesized and famously were synthesized. For example, in the 1940s by Albert Hofmann, who discovered LSD. LSD really being the prototypical psychedelic, the one that changed everything in terms of modern scientific interest in these compounds. And that catalyzed a wave of interest in psychiatry. First, people thought, wow, we have these incredible tools to model aspects of psychopathology. We can mimic the state of psychosis and perhaps learn some of the secrets of the brain chemistry of psychosis. Perhaps a naturally occurring psychedelic is released during a psychotic episode. So that's part of it. The other, perhaps paradoxical part of the story is that psychedelics were also looked at as therapeutics and are now beginning to be looked at again as therapeutics. So in some of the research that I've done at Imperial, we've looked at psilocybin, which is found in so-called magic mushrooms. And we've looked at it as a treatment alongside I would say contextual manipulation or psychological support, if you want, for treating treatment-resistant depression. There's some quite promising early outcomes. And part of how this treatment seems to work is related to this property of these compounds being mind-revealing. And so if you simply ask people after a treatment with psilocybin, whether it worked for them and if so, how, they often say that it was insight that made the difference, that they discovered something about themselves, something about how they relate to their emotions, their past experiences, how they relate to other people, their behaviors, their perspectives on the world. They often say that they are afforded a rare, incredibly rare opportunity to truly step outside of themselves and see themselves less as a subject and more as a sort of object of observation. They can see themselves with the kind of equanimity that another person might see them, and so that ability to not be at the mercy of one's ego or one's sense of self and identity and all the defenses that are wrapped up in that narrative and those narratives that we tell about ourselves, about ourselves, and so that ability to step outside of oneself and see the bigger picture seems to relate to how these compounds can be useful. There's a useful analogy that comes from the astronauts who partook in the lunar missions, who coined the term the overview effect. And you often hear very similar accounts from people after having had a psychedelic experience, that ability to see the bigger picture, to put things in perspective, allowed them to be less at the mercy of the pull of a depression or the pull of an addiction. And so part of the agenda now really with the research that I'm doing is to try and demystify this very rich, psychologically rich and actually quite a sort of a magnet for mystical type thinking about how these compounds work, compounds that in their plant form have been used for maybe thousands of years in ceremonial contexts and very much thought of in a magical, mystical way. But now we have this opportunity with modern neuroscience to demystify some of this without reducing it, without taking away the magic in a poetic sense, but understanding the nature of the experience, how these compounds are affecting this thing of nature that is our brains, and that's an incredible opportunity and privilege, and then tying it in with some of these themes that you'll hear in the context of inspiration and insight and creativity, that are almost often hinting, I think, at the mechanisms that there's a flash of insight, a moment of epiphany. All of a sudden I can see, in the simplicity and the elegance of the solution. And I think there's a hint at what might be going on in the brain, that perhaps the way the mind and the brain can gravitate into certain configurations of thinking, and of course that's going to have a biological underpinning. The brain may well gravitate to particular patterns and modes of functioning, but if perhaps we were to represent that as a landscape, and let's take an example of depression, for example, there may literally be a depression in this landscape, such that one's mind is pulled into this literal depression, and it's very hard to get out of. But if we introduce something like a psychedelic, what it might be doing, this is in the domain of a hypothesis, but it's also something that we're getting a bit of data to inform on, and it is resonating with this hypothesis that there may be a flattening of that energy landscape, such that the mind and the brain can visit different patterns, and maybe that's part of the picture here in terms of how these compounds promote insight and how that might be therapeutically useful. Thanks.